Hello everyone, welcome back for another week of web production. Quick note about the course outline. I made some changes to the schedule. I decided to move up the lessons on CSS. So we're going to start looking at CSS this week. Woohoo! I think it'll be a little bit better to do it this way. So I took the stuff for images and links, which get pretty complicated, and moved them down to later in the semester. And it's better to do it then because that's closer to project time where we will actually use the links and images. So I think it's better if we push that off and we start our introduction to CSS sooner. So we're going to dive right in today and learn some CSS. So coming from the textbook, this is chapter 5 of the textbook, which you have access to in Leia. So we are talking about the introduction to CSS. What is CSS? You've heard me mention it a bunch of times since we started this course on week 1, explaining that CSS is another layer on top of HTML. It stands for Cascading Style Sheets. Cascading Style Sheets. So let's think about that for a moment. Main keyword here is style. So CSS is another programming language, you could say, that is involved in making a website. We've been using HTML to create the content of our website. CSS is used to change the style of our website. And what do I mean by style? Well, the appearance of our HTML tags and the layout of our HTML tags. So when we're talking about changing the style of our websites, we're talking about using CSS to change the appearance and the layout of our HTML elements. Up until now, we've been using just HTML, and what that means, the web browser is in control of the appearance of the HTML tags that we use. So if we use a heading or a paragraph or a list or a table, the web browser that you're using has its own styles for how it wants to display these HTML tags. But CSS is a powerful layer on top of HTML that allows us to customize the appearance of these tags however we want. So this chapter we're going to introduce the CSS language, its syntax, the rules we need to write CSS, and the basics of how we could incorporate it into our HTML page. So first let's look at the syntax. So yes, more syntax to learn, and it's different than HTML. So we put CSS into our HTML files, into our HTML code, but it's its own language with its own syntax. So we have to learn another syntax when we are writing our CSS. The syntax is as follows: property, colon, value. And then it closes with a semicolon. So this is just a basic generic syntax. I'm not talking about any specific style right now, but it's basically anytime we want to change the appearance or layout, we need to use this syntax and specify what style we want to change. So this total thing that we're looking at here, even though it's a generic example, it's a generic example of a declaration. So that's what I'm going to call it. This entire line of code is a declaration. When we use our CSS to customize the style, the appearance, the layout of our website, we use a series of declarations to say, hey, I want to style this way. So a declaration consists of a property and a value that we want to style. The property is the thing we want to style, and the value is how we're deciding to style it. So I have some examples over here. For example, if we wanted to change the text color, we have a CSS property called color. So we can use color with the two dots and then set the value for the color to be blue. We have a CSS property for the background color. If we want to change the background color of an HTML tag, we can set the background color property to a value of red. Or if we want to change something like the font size, we could use the font size property and change the value to something like 14 pixels. So we don't invent the CSS properties. We just need to be aware of which properties are available to us in the CSS language. So for example, color, background color, and font size are some things we can do to customize these properties, the text color, the background color, and the font size. And then we have a whole set of possible values that we could apply to these properties. So we don't invent the values. There's certain values that apply to each property, and slowly and surely we're going to learn more and more about these CSS properties that we could use and the values that are possible to use with them. So for now, let's just be sure that we're clear on this syntax, okay? Every time you want to style something in CSS, doesn't matter what, we have to follow this syntax. The property that you want to style with 2 dots, the colon, and then the value that you're applying to that property, followed by a semicolon. You have to think like a computer that's looking at your code and is trying to understand it. So we have to follow these very strict rules so that the web browser knows to look for a property and the value for that property that you're setting without being confused because of some improper syntax. So make sure we're clear on this syntax, and then we can move on to start learning some of the CSS properties and values that we're going to use. A little note, just like HTML, white space is collapsed. So you can put extra spaces wherever you want in these uh, declarations between the properties and the semicolons and the colons and the values to help organize your code however you want. We'll look at some different ways to do this um, in the future. Okay, so those are some examples. We looked at color, background color, and font size. And we will see a lot more as time goes on. Some values are predefined keywords. So for example, if we're trying to align something horizontally in the page, we'll have values for left or right. Other values can be sizes, lengths, percentages, or colors. So many different ways to specify values. And you'll see at the end of this chapter a list of all the properties and values that we actually use in this class. So you have many ways to look up properties and values. The way I suggest is using the textbook that I provide to you, but another very good way is using Google. You can go to Google and type CSS. Just make sure you type CSS before whatever you're trying to look for, and then whatever you're trying to look for. So CSS text color. So imagine you get this idea that you want to change the text color, then you can type CSS text color into Google. Usually what pops up is the results from W3 Schools. W3 Schools is the leading authority on CSS values and the documentation on how to use them. So if you ever see a link with W3 Schools, it's a great resource to find. So I looked for CSS text color, and the first result is CSS text from W3 Schools, and it gives you a whole explanation of how to use it. This is definitely a little bit more advanced, but as you get comfortable writing CSS, this will all make sense to you, and you could come to this website and look at the examples they provide, and even click on this Try It Yourself button and start experimenting with code. So you can change the values over here, click Run, and then watch it update here in the output. So for example, let me zoom in a bit. So over here, they're setting the body color to blue and the H1 color to green. So you could come here and maybe try a different value. Let's set the body color to red and the H1 color to yellow. I'm going to click Run. And there you have it. So this W3 Schools is an excellent resource to look up properties and values. You have that, and you also have my textbook at your disposal to help you study these properties and values. But let's go through some more ourselves. Keep in mind, this is the process we usually go through when creating our website. And this will help us situate CSS relative to HTML and the website itself. When we're creating a website, we usually have content. We have content, text and images that we want to post to the website. Then we have to use HTML to mark up this content. So we're telling the web browser what type of content it is. Is it a heading? Is it a paragraph? Is it a list? And so on. That's as far as we got with HTML. And now we're adding a new layer on top of this, is we're adding CSS to our HTML. So this is an example of putting CSS into the tag itself, where we add the style over here and put some CSS properties inside the HTML tag. But there are several ways to incorporate CSS, and we're going to look at one of them right now. Shortly. First, let's just understand why CSS. Well, CSS is relatively new compared to HTML. It came later. HTML was first. CSS came along to offer more styling possibilities. And what's really cool about CSS is you could change the style of multiple HTML tags at the same time. So this example I showed you up here isn't a great example because the CSS is getting applied to this one specific tag only. So these styles, the color blue, the font size 30px, which stands for pixels, it's getting applied to the H1 tag only. But we're going to learn a different way to insert CSS into our page that will allow us to apply styles to multiple tags at the same time. Furthermore, if you're interested, at some point we'll learn how to take the CSS styles and move it out of our HTML page and allow it to control the entire website from one centralized location. So if you have a more advanced website with multiple pages, you could use what's called an external CSS style sheet, and that will allow you to control the appearance and layout of multiple HTML pages. So it's pretty powerful. Imagine you have a website with dozens of pages. In one centralized location, you could control the styles of all the H1 tags, all the P tags, and even more, like the layout of all your containers and margins and columns and all that stuff in one centralized location. And a little higher level to think about, it's a very different perspective on creating websites. By using CSS, we separate the website content from the website presentation. What do I mean by that? So when you're creating your website, as discussed earlier, you have some content that you want to upload to the internet. So you could have one paradigm looking at just the content of the website itself, which is the HTML, the text, and the markup tags that are marking up this content. But then you have on a separate layer, independent of the content, you have CSS controlling its presentation. So you can use CSS to change the appearance and layout of this content separately from actually creating the content itself. And some, eye candy, some HTML, CSS eye candy here to exemplify this is this site called CSS Zen Garden. So here is the link to the content of this website called CSS Zen Garden. And this pretty much looks similar to what we've been doing up until now, just HTML. So we just have basic text, we have headings, we have paragraphs, and we have, well, there are links here. We didn't look at links yet, but we did look at lists. So this is the basics of the HTML content that we've been seeing up until now. And this website, the purpose of this site is to ask people to create CSS for it. So there's literally hundreds of examples of people creating their own CSS style sheets to change the appearance and layout of this HTML content, and I pulled out just a few examples. So all of them have the exact same content. So the HTML content and tags are pretty much the same. The only thing that's different is the CSS that's being applied to them. So these are just a few examples of with the exact same content, how you could get completely different websites. So CSS is what's being used here to control the appearance and layout of this HTML content. And this is inspiration for you on where we are heading. Moving away from creating just plain text websites and starting to look at controlling the appearance and layout of our website and adding graphical things like colors and images and fonts that are more beautiful. So it's a pretty cool website. That's not there anymore. Where it shows you lots of different examples um, of how we have this new perspective on creating websites, which is the content is one thing, the HTML tags and the content it is marking up is one piece of the puzzle. And then on another layer, above this layer, we have the presentation, which is controlled by CSS. Okay, so there are three different ways to incorporate CSS into your HTML pages. What you saw above was called inline CSS. That's where we put CSS very specifically applied to one specific tag. So I'm not going to spend very long going over it because we're not really going to use it in my class. Like I was saying, it gets applied to that one tag only. I'd rather look at this second method over here called internal CSS style sheets. And these internal CSS style sheets are used to control the appearance of multiple tags at the same time. Okay, so for my class, we're not really going to look at inline. And external CSS style sheets, we might get to it, but it's pretty much the same thing as internal. Okay, so depending on your final project towards the end of the semester, we might start having a look at external style sheets, but for now, our focus will be completely on internal CSS style sheets. So I'm going to skip over method number 1 and make my way down to method number 2, internal style sheet. So there is an extra step to set up an internal style sheet, but once you have it set up, it is much more powerful. So that's why it's good to take a moment just to create a CSS style sheet and learn how to make our CSS style declarations in the style sheet, because it's allowing us to control the appearance of all the tags in our page in one place. So instead of putting CSS declarations inside the HTML tag, we're actually putting them in the head of the page inside what we call a style sheet. So you might remember from our structural tags that we discussed on week 2 or week 3, where we talked about the difference between the head and the body. We talked about the head being the place to put descriptive content, and the body the place to put the content. So we've been working inside the body, putting the HTML content of our website. Now that we're looking at CSS, we're starting to think about the appearance and layout. These are descriptive elements and they belong in the head. So here's how we create an internal style sheet. We do it by going into the head section of our code and we put a style tag inside the head. So we're learning one new HTML tag here. It's called the style tag. And it's what we need to create a style sheet in our HTML page. So we'd go up here into the head and insert a tag called the style tag. It has the opening style tag and it is paired with the closing style tag just below. This is the way I recommend you set up this style tag so that you can have a lot of space to work inside the style tag, and we use indentation to see that the opening and the closing tags are correctly paired, and it's very easy to see. So that's the first half of creating a CSS style sheet. Not so bad, right? We just go into the head of our page and we add this style tag. The second thing we need to learn about is called selectors. So think about it. If we're trying to style some HTML tag in our page, we're not actually putting this style in the tag. Therefore, how will the web browser know which tag we want to style? That's why we have what we call a selector. So you can see what I'm highlighting over here. This is an example of just some generic selector. It's not showing you a specific tag selector. I'm just showing you the syntax. So we use these selectors to tell the web browser which HTML tags we want to style. So we would put over here where it says selector, the name of the tag that we want to style. We put these curly braces, and then all the CSS decorations that we put inside the CSS selector will get applied to that tag that we are selecting. So for example, if I wanted to style the paragraph tag, I would simply come here and instead of selector, I would put the letter P. So this letter P is the tag name that we're trying to style. Then we have these curly braces over here as our little home for where we're going to put all the CSS declarations that get applied to the P tag. So just be careful. These curly braces, they are next to the letter P on the keyboard. They're grouped with the square brackets, and you have to hold the Shift button to get to them. We'll take a look at that in the lab time as we look at the exercises. Okay, so let's recap here. We are using internal CSS style sheets because we could use CSS selectors to select a tag and change the style of all instances of that tag on the page. So if I want to change the style of my paragraph tags, I could put it inside the style sheet and all of the paragraphs will get updated. So inside the head of our page, we use the style tag to create the style sheet. Inside the style sheet, we use a selector to choose which tags we're trying to style. And then inside the selector, we are putting all the declarations, so the properties and the values that we're trying to style. Okay, so here's a specific example. So this is a real example with actual code that would work. So let's have a look in the body. Over here, I have two paragraphs. Paragraph number 1 and paragraph number 2. So this is a very simple example. It's a web page that has 2 lines of text that are paragraphs. And this is the content of the page in the body. So if we look up here in the head, you'll see that I've added a CSS style sheet over here. The opening style tag is here. The closing style tag is there. And inside this style sheet, I've created one selector for the p tags, the paragraphs, with the curly braces. Don't forget the curly braces, that's part of the selector. The selector is the tag name and the curly braces that are surrounding the declarations. So now I'm highlighting the declarations. You can see that the selector starts before the declarations and it has a curly brace at the end after the declarations to create a little home base for these declarations. And what am I styling inside the selector? So the paragraphs are going to have the color blue and a font size of 30px, 30 pixels. So in this situation, all the paragraphs in the page will have their color blue and this font size of 30 pixels. Don't forget this syntax. We have the 2 dots and the semicolon. So the property that we're trying to style, the colon, the value that we're applying to that property, and then the semicolon. And that's pretty much it. So a little bit of a learning curve to get started, but once it starts making sense on how to create a style sheet, a selector, and then the CSS style declarations inside the selector, it's pretty much smooth sailing from there. It's just a matter of learning what are the properties available to us that we could use to style and change the appearance and layout of our website. So this week it's very important that we get the syntax down. We get the ideas about how to insert CSS into our HTML page. And over time, slowly, we're going to learn more and more CSS properties and values that we can use to style the page. So to practice doing this, and I suggest you try this yourself, I opened up brackets. I'm going to create a new file for us to work with. So I'm going to create a new file here in my demo folder and call it demo4.html. Don't forget .html. If you do, then brackets will have a hard time helping you out with code assist. So there we go. I have an empty file called demo4.html, and I will go ahead and insert the HTML template and then save the file. I'm going to insert 2 paragraphs into the page. I will save the file and I will preview it. There we go. So now to create the CSS, oops, I forgot to put my title. There we go. So here's where I recommend you put the CSS style sheet, right after the title. So go to the end of the title tag, put a new line, and then you could insert the style tag. So open a new tag with the angled bracket, start typing style. I recommend you use Code Assist to help you out. And then when you close the tag, brackets will be so kind and put the closing tag for you. What I like to do right away is push the enter button a few times, just like that, because now I have some nice white space here I could use to create my CSS selectors and styles. Okay, so we've just created an internal CSS style sheet. It's not actually doing anything yet because we haven't put any CSS styles inside, but let's go ahead and do that now. So like the demo from the textbook, I want to select all the p tags, the paragraph tags on the page, and style them a certain way. So I'm going to write my p tag selector by typing the tag name, which in this case is just the letter P. And then I will put my curly braces, or I like to call them my squiggly brackets. So just next to the letter P on the keyboard, hold Shift and hit the square brackets. It'll use the one above it, which is the curly brace. And again, it's going to put the closing curly brace for you. So even though I just typed the opening curly brace, brackets was nice enough to put the closing curly brace for me. What I like to do is right away push enter again. This will take the curly brace and put it down, and it just creates a really nice structure, a nice visual way to see our CSS code, and it'll help us avoid errors. Keep in mind white space is ignored, white space is collapsed, all the spaces and line breaks and tabs that you put will be ignored. So it's really a matter of personal preference how you like to organize your CSS file. For now, I recommend you do it this way. We're going to put one CSS style declaration on each line, and that way it'll be very easy for us to avoid mistakes or catch any mistakes as they come. Okay, so we now have a selector. Nothing is happening in the preview. That's normal because we didn't actually put any style declarations inside. So we're now prepared to select the tag and to style it. So we just need to put our styles inside. So here on the new line, it's indented a little bit. It's perfect for me. I'm going to add the color. You'll see Code Assist is very helpful. As I start typing color, it starts popping up all the CSS properties that start with what I'm typing. I recommend you use Code Assist. It will help you avoid typos. So I'm going to click on color. It was even nice enough to put the 2 dots for you. Super helpful. Okay. And what color? Let's make it red. As I start typing the color name, you see that Code Assist is giving me all the values that have what I'm typing in it. I'm going to click on, ooh, I was originally going to say red. I was intrigued by Rebecca purple, but no, let's just go with red. It'll be easier to see. And there you have it. Are we done? No, we forgot something. The semicolon. So brackets won't put the semicolon for you. That's something you have to remember to put yourself. And there you have it. That's your first CSS style declaration. We've selected the p tag using the tag name and the curly braces. And inside the curly braces, we put our first style declaration. We chose the property that we want to style, and we assigned a value to that property. And you can see that over here in the preview. Now both paragraphs in the page have been styled red. Let's try another one. So I'm going to go after the semicolon and put a new line. And like the textbook, I'm going to change the font size. So I'm going to put font. I'm going to start typing font. And you see it gives me a list of all the things that we could do to fonts. So I'm going to click on font dash size. And I'm going to type 30px. Oh, and you saw instantly in the live preview, the font size got a lot bigger. So we've used the selector to select the p tags, and we've now used the font size property and changed its value to 30. So a few little notes. Property names will never have a space in them. So that's why font size here has this dash. Okay, so this would be an error. So keep in mind, there's never going to be a space inside a property name. Spaces outside the property name is perfectly fine, but inside the property name it's not. And the same thing with the value. So here we put 30px, but notice that it's smushed together into one. If I put a space like that, that would actually be a syntax error. You see, the live preview lost the styling because this is actually an error. The web browser doesn't understand what 30 is. You need to tell it a unit, and because of the space, it's not seeing the unit. So make sure there's no spaces in the actual value that you put. So that's one thing. And remember that properties are fixed. You only have a certain number of properties that you could use to style, but the values themselves, you have a lot more flexibility over that. So why did I choose 30px? It's just the number I chose. But you can make it bigger. Let's try 50px. Let's try 500px. Okay, that's way too big. 200? There we go. Super big. Or you can make it pretty, whoops. Or you can make it pretty small. Let's try 5px. Super, super tiny. So you have a little bit more control over the values that you put inside your CSS. And there you have it. So that's our first CSS style sheet. What we created here is called a style sheet. we use the selector to target the p tags, and then we put some style declarations to change the style of the p tags. Remember that white space is ignored. So this is the style I recommend. So I went down here in the textbook, uh, skipping method 3. Okay, we're not going to do external style sheets anytime soon. I went to this section here where it talks about formatting a style sheet. So what I did was using this formatting style where the selector is like that, and then you have one declaration per line. But there is other styles. It's really a matter of personal preference, how you want to style your page. This is another common preference, is to put the selector and the values all on one line. And that would look something like this. You'd be removing the white space and keeping the declarations all on one line. Personal preference, it's more compact, but it's a little bit harder to read. So depending on what you're doing, you might like that. But I really recommend, especially for the first stages of learning CSS, that you adopt this preference, where you have the selector here clearly living on its own space, and then you have one declaration per line to keep your style sheet nice and organized. What we just looked at was an example of a tag selector. So we use tag selectors. We just use one tag selector to select the p tag, and here's what it does. Tag selectors are used to select all instances of a specific HTML tag on your page. So if you use, for example, the p tag selector, all the p tags in the page will get styled with that CSS. There are other types of selectors, ID selectors and class selectors. We're not going to look at those yet. Those are going to come in a few weeks. So let's do another quick example. Let's try it for a different tag. Let's add an H1 tag over here. Get my preview going. And I will add an H1 tag over here. Super cool CSS as my heading. And you can see it over here. So let's go through this again. I'm going to go outside of the curly braces. Make sure you're not inside the curly braces. If you start typing your next selector inside here, that will create a problem. So I'm going to go at the end of the curly brace and put a new line, maybe two even, just to add some white space. And then to select the H1 tag, it's the same like the paragraph where you just type the tag name. So I'll type H1. And then don't forget the curly braces, which I will push the closing one to new line. And then we can start styling our heading. Let's go ahead and change the font size of the heading. There we go. There you have it. So now we've used a tag selector for the p tags and a tag selector for the h1 tags to style their different properties. So once you get that down, please pause the video, make sure that you're able to do that. And of course, bring any questions or issues to the lab time coming up. I'm going to skip ahead and get to the end of the chapter where I have the common CSS properties. So once you've understood what we just did, how to create a style sheet, how to create a selector, and how to put a CSS declaration inside the selector, the next step is just a matter of learning which properties are available to us. And I've put at the end of this chapter all the ones that we use in this class. So right now it looks like, oh my gosh, there's a lot, but they are pretty intuitive. And we're going to learn them slowly, step by step. So the ones that we are focused on this week is going to be this group over here. The CSS properties that we could use to style text. So we have things to style the text color, the text alignment, the font size, the font family, so we could change the actual font, the font weight, so if we want to make it bold or not, the font style, if we want to make it italics, text decoration, if we want to add some underline, and so on. So I'm going to have you work in the exercises using these properties and figuring out the values for them. So how do you know what the values are for them? Well, on the next page, I give you a link to the CSS reference, which could be useful. Some of you might be interested to check out that W3 Schools website to see the CSS reference, which means it's kind of like a manual. It's kind of like a dictionary of all the CSS properties and values. Or you could simply look at this page over here once you understand how this table works and see all the values that we're going to need in my class over here. So for example, we're in the general section. Let's skip past that. Let's look for the section with text. Here we go. So here's a list of all the CSS properties listed above for text and the possible values and an explanation of how to use them. So for example, if you want to change the color, you can look at the possible values over here. Color name, hexadecimal, RGB, different possible values that you can use, and a little bit of an explanation. If you want to see the text alignment, if you want to horizontally align your text, you can see text alignment property over here and the different values that you could apply to that text align property over here. And each value has its own explanation. So this is a great place to look up CSS properties and values. And finally, there's going to be a few special ones that I want to teach you about more in depth. So that's the last thing I'm going to show you right now. Specifying color, specifying font families, and a couple more. So let's have a look at colors. You can specify colors of a bunch of different things. One thing which we saw already is the text color. But regardless of what we're trying to do, what we're trying to change the color of, whenever you're specifying a color, it's always going to be the same way. There are many different ways to specify color. The simplest one is what we saw already, is you can simply type the color name. Chances are, if you can think of it, it exists in the CSS library. So if I come over here and I want to change the text color to something else, if you could think of the color, it exists, and you could probably type it in. See, yellow, black, white, red, brown, purple, orange, teal. There are tons of colors. So you can have a look over here and see a pretty big list of what exists. If you want the full reference, there is a link here below with a color reference. Or if you want to do your own thing and choose a color picker, there are other links here. But let me quickly go over some other ways to specify color. In the simplest case, this is the easiest way. But if you want to get a little bit more specific with your colors and customize them, you might have to learn a different way. So here we have what's called the hex code. And what the hex code does is it mixes up the three different channels of color. R for red, G for green, and B for blue. RGB. Right? So you might remember from Photoshop, any color can be created from a mix of the primary colors, and computers work with RGB. If you mix a certain amount of red with a certain amount of green and a certain amount of blue, you'll create a new color. So the hex code has two values for red, two values for green, and two values for blue. So it's impossible to read this easily and understand what color it is. But keep in mind, if you see that, don't be scared, it's just a hex code. So if you were to use something like a color picker, so this link on the bottom opens up a color picker. Let me choose this color over here, this purple. So you can see over here, it's giving me the hex code of the color. So if I were to take this weird looking thing over here and copy it, head on over to my brackets, and now I could change this red thing to a hashtag, and I'm going to paste in the hex code. You could get this funky purple color that we saw in the color picker. Again, don't stress right now. The simplest way to specify color is just by typing the name of the color. But there are more advanced ways to get more specific colors using the hex code or the RGB value. RGB is exactly like hex code, but we're using numbers and a bit of a different syntax to mix the different channels of color. Okay, so this will come with time. Don't worry about it too much right now. What you need to worry about now is just learning the different color names and how to apply them in your code. All right, the next thing, font families. I told you could change the font, right? So specifying font family is a little bit weird inside of CSS, and we're going to learn about it right now. So let's get the demo open. Let's come over here, and in the paragraph selector, I'm going to add a new line for font dash family. And Code Assist is helping us out here. Have a look at what it popped up. Cursive, fantasy, inherit, monospace, sans serif, and serif. So what it's proposing is actually a type of font. You might remember from our digital art class where we talked about the different kinds of fonts. So these are font categories. So if I were to select a font category of sans serif, there we go, you might have saw the text update and it started using a sans serif font. Let's put it back to a serif font, and now it's using a serif font. Let's try a different one, the cursive, and there's even fantasy. Okay, so these are examples of font categories. A generic family. So in my textbook, that's what this line is here. You could specify fonts using a generic family. The thing about fonts is not everyone has the same fonts on their computer. And that's why by specifying a font family, you're telling the web browser, hey, go to the computer and find me a sans serif font. You don't know specifically what it is, but you're going to be sure that at least you have a sans serif font. If you want to get more specific, then you actually need to use a specific font family name. So if you know that you want specifically the Arial font, then what you should do is actually type the font Arial. So that's good. The problem with that though is not everybody has the same fonts on their computer. So if you have Arial on your computer, it's going to look fine. But if somebody else on their computer doesn't have the Arial font, then you're out of luck. You're not sure what they're going to get on their end. So that's why what we do in CSS is we use what's called a fallback system. We list our fonts in order of preference, and we always end with a generic family in case the font isn't available. So this is okay. I'm going to type Arial. But just in case they don't have Arial, what I'm going to do is put a comma, and I'm going to put sans serif. So this is a fallback system. This is saying, please try using Arial, but if it's not available, just choose me a sans serif font. Okay, so it's a fallback system, and it's saying If you have this Arial font, great, use it. If not, choose me a sans serif font. This gives you a bit more control because if the user doesn't have the font on their computer, at least you're using a sans serif font. Okay, so you should learn what the families are. There's the most common ones are going to be serif, sans serif, and cursive. And then you could get a bit more specific and learn which font families you like, but don't worry too much about it. What's really important is this generic family over here, and we will learn different ways of specifying fonts at a later time. Okay, so the syntax for this is a little bit more complicated. You still have the property, which is the font family, and then the colon, but the value here is a little bit more complex because you have more than one. You put the first font over here with a comma, and then the second font over here. You can even have more than one. Let's do Times New Roman. Instead of a sans serif, let's try Times New Roman. The thing about Times New Roman is it has spaces in its name. So for this, we need to put quotation marks. That's why you see in my textbook some quotation marks. And then let's put our comma, and let's put serif, because Times New Roman is a serif font. Okay, so that's an example for the serif font, and what you saw earlier was an example for a sans serif font. And I remind you, don't worry, we have time to practice this in the lab time, and you'll have exercises to help you go over this and help you remember. And the last thing to talk about in this lecture is font sizes. So why did I use px, and what are the other units? So we have two ways of specifying font sizes. One is a fixed size. By using px, which stands for pixels, I'm telling it a very specific size. But there are other ways to specify fonts, and we're going to learn a cool way using percentages. So these are relative sizes. By using a percentage, you can make it a certain size relative to something else. So to explain how I do this, I'm actually also going to talk about styling the body tag. The body tag. So let's have a look. First thing I want to do is style the body tag. It might seem strange, but think about it. The body tag here is the parent of all the other tags in the content of our web page. So what's really cool about styling the body tag is it's going to apply default styles to all the tags in the page. It kind of works like inheritance with your genetics or with your family. You could think of a family metaphor. So the parent is the body, and it has all these happy little children. And these happy little children will inherit certain properties from their parent. So if we style the body tag, all the other tags inside will benefit from inheriting these styles. So let's go up into our style sheet. Let me actually delete all this stuff. I think it'll be clearer if we delete it. So if I go back up here in the style sheet and type the body tag selector and put my squigglies, I've now written a selector to select this body tag over here and indirectly all its children. So this is a great place to specify default styles that apply to the entire page. Let's try specifying the color here. Let's go with, how about aquamarine? Ooh, so pretty. There we go, some aquamarine color. And you can see, even though it's only applied to the body, all the tags inside the body are getting it. So But the purpose of this was to talk about font size. So the body tag selector is the place to put the default styles for the page. So this is the place where I will put the default font size for the entire page. I'm going to type font dash size. Remember, it's one word, font size. And I'm going to type 12px. Do you see how everything changed in the preview over here? This is because we're setting the default font size for the page, and all the other tags are going to size themselves relative to that. Let's change that relative sizing ourselves. I'm going to come here and rewrite the selector for the h1 tag. And I'm going to put the font size in here. And instead of using a fixed size, so you can use a fixed size like 26px, for example, I'm going to use a relative size. I'm going to say 300%. Why 300%? It's 3 times bigger than the default font size. If I were to put 100%, that's exactly the same size as the default. So you see at 100%, I'm sizing the h1 tags to be the same size as the default. That's why in the output over here, you can see that the font sizes are the same. If I change it to 200%, it's actually going to be twice as big. So the font size of all the h1 tags would actually be double this, which is 24 pixels. Let's make our h1 tags nice and big. I'm going to put 300%. And then for the p tags, I'm going to put the p tag selector and type my font size declaration. And I will use, let's put 150%. So just a bit bigger than the default. And there you have it. We are using a fixed size to set the default, so 12 pixels. And then we're sizing all the other tags relative to that one. What's cool about that, if I decide to change the font size later, if I say, oh, this is too small, let me come here into the body and increase this from 12 till 14. And you see how everything changed? Because now the h1 tags are 300% of the body tag, and the p tags are 150% of the body tag. So that's it. Keep that in mind. This is the way I suggest you do your font sizes. You use the fixed size for the default in the body, and then you use the relative size for all the other tags. So that is it for this lecture today. To recap, you've learned how to create an internal CSS style sheet to change the appearance and layout of the specific HTML tags in your page. We used a tag selector to select all instances of a specific tag in your page. You've seen the body tag selector, you've seen the h1 tag selector, and we've seen the p tag selector. And you could really use this syntax to select any tag in your page. And finally, we learned about the CSS declaration syntax to create CSS styles and change the appearance or layout of our HTML tags. It includes the property name with the 2 dots and then the value followed by the semicolon. You will now have a few exercises to help you practice this. Exercise set 4. It's pretty tedious, and that's what's going to help you remember. Okay, so first one is just a simple one to create an internal style sheet and a few selectors. So in this exercise, you should be adding the selector that you see in the left column and styling the things that I'm describing in the right column. So you'll style the h1 tags, you'll style the h2 tags, and you'll style the paragraph tags. The next one is a little bit more interesting. So the next one is something that you should fill out on your own. It's not really a coding exercise. If you have a look at exercise 4B and the exercise file that comes with it, you'll see that I don't want you to actually write code uh, in this file. I want you to use this file to help you practice. So let me download this file for you so I can show you how it works. So you should be downloading this file, opening it, moving it into your folder, and then opening it with brackets. And let's have a look at what this actually is. I'm going to open my live preview over here. So you'll see I have a lot of content in here. And what it is it's explaining the different text styles that you could have. So for example, here I'm talking about typographic alignment. I'm talking about aligning your text to the left, to the right, centered, and justified. And the paragraph actually explains what it's doing. So, I mean, flush left is pretty obvious, but if you want more details about what it's doing, these paragraphs actually explain what each one is doing. What I want you to do, okay, is just use this p tag selector to determine what the CSS property is and what it's doing. So for example, in the exercise, I want you to fill out this table. I want you to, this one is already done for you. Flush left, text align left. So it's telling you that if you want to do flush left alignment, the property that you need to use is the text align property, and the value you need to apply to it is left. So what will it be for flush right? Well, in this case, it's pretty simple because all of these uh, all of these outputs will be using the same CSS property. So all of them will be using the text align property. So you could fill that in yourself. And then you just need to figure out what is the value needed to make it flush right. What is the value needed to make it centered? So this is where you could use the textbook, the CSS reference. Remember I showed you at the end of the chapter, we have all the properties and the values listed. So I want you to go look up the values that you need to complete this exercise. And what you should do to test it is use this HTML file to check it out. So if you think the correct value is right, you could come here in the paragraph tag selector and change the value of this declaration to right. And did you see what happened? All the paragraphs are now flush right. And then that's it. I don't want you to actually code this for real. I want you to use this file and the live preview just to see the results. So I would come back here and I would type right, and I would continue. So centered text, what do we need to text align center? Well, that's a pretty simple one. I'm going to come here and change it to center. And then you can see the results here in the preview. Okay, so this exercise is really to get you to learn the different um, CSS properties that you have for styling text and to see the results when you use them. And then finally, you have exercise C, which talks a bit about the body tag selector, like I showed in the demo. You will style the defaults for the page using the body tag. And then you have some extra practice here, which is more like a real scenario of styling an HTML page. So there you have it. First exercise, just to get you practicing creating an internal style sheet. 4B is to get you to learn all the different text styles. And 4C is more like a realistic scenario where you need to actually style a web page. So that's it for this video. I'm glad you have it to refer to, and I will see you during the lab time to answer any questions you may have and to help you code these exercises.